What if the world you knew, the one you took for granted with its buzzing notifications and endless distractions, suddenly ended? Not with a bang, but with a chilling red alert flashing across your phone screen? Yeah, that's how my story, and maybe humanity's story, took a turn for the absolutely terrifying. It's funny the things you remember, the mundane details that cling to the edges of monumental moments. Like the lukewarm coffee I was nursing, probably hours old, or the textbook stubbornly refusing to stay open to the right page. College life, right? A constant juggle of deadlines, late-night study sessions, and the desperate hope of snatching a few hours of sleep before it all started again. I was hunched over my desk in my cramped dorm room, lost in the labyrinthine world of organic chemistry, when the shrill, insistent tones sliced through the relative quiet. My phone, usually a beacon of social media and news updates, was screaming at me. Not a notification, not a text, an emergency alert. The screen was dominated by a crimson banner so vivid it felt like it was bleeding into my retinas. Emergency alert! It blared in stark white letters. Zombie outbreak detected. Seek immediate shelter. Zombie outbreak. The words hung in the air, ridiculous, impossible, yet undeniably there. My first reaction was disbelief, a choked laugh rising in my throat. Hack? Prank? Some elaborate, tasteless joke? My fingers trembled as I reread the message, searching for any hint of irony, any clue that this was some kind of digital nightmare. But the stark simplicity of the words, the unwavering red glare of the alert, sent a shiver crawling down my spine. Before I could even process the absurdity, the floor above me erupted. A cacophony of shouts, thuds, and panicked cries ripped through the thin walls of the dorm. It wasn't just noise. It was chaos unleashed. My heart leaped into my throat, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. Textbooks forgotten, coffee abandoned. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging through my veins. I threw open my door and stepped into a hallway transformed into a scene of utter pandemonium. Students were spilling out of their rooms, faces contorted with terror, eyes wide with a primal fear I'd only ever seen in movies. Some were frantically stuffing backpacks with clothes, laptops, anything they could grab. Others, seemingly paralyzed by panic, were just bolting for the exits, shoving past anyone in their way. What's happening? I yelled over the din, grabbing the arm of a girl rushing past, her face streaked with tears. She just shook her head, eyes darting wildly around, and pulled away, muttering something about the gym and Lincoln High. Rumors, whispered shouts, fragments of panicked conversations swirled around me like debris in a storm. Evacuation site, Lincoln High School, gym, official shelter, zombie outbreak. The words, still surreal, started to coalesce into a terrifying picture. Lincoln High was just a few blocks from campus, a local high school I'd only ever driven past. The gym, was that really safer than a dorm room? It all felt like a scene ripped straight from a B-movie horror flick, ludicrous and yet. The terror on everyone's faces was undeniably real. Doubt warred with a sickening sense of urgency. Normally, I'd scoff at a zombie apocalypse, but looking at the raw, visceral fear etched onto the faces around me, I couldn't dismiss it so easily. If it was a hoax, it was unbelievably cruel, the most elaborate and terrifying prank imaginable. And if it wasn't, the thought sent a fresh wave of ice water through my veins. I had absolutely no idea what to do. Each step I took down the hallway was punctuated by the increasing volume of screams and shouts echoing from outside. It was like the panic was spreading contagiously, leaping from person to person. In the lobby, the scene was even more frantic. Students huddled in small groups, sobbing, shouting into their phones, desperately trying to reach loved ones. The air was thick with desperation, choked with fear. A girl near the front doors was wailing into her phone. "Mom! Mom! Pick up! They're everywhere." I saw, "Oh God, Mom!" My own hand went instinctively to my pocket, fumbling for my phone. Parents. I had to call my parents. But the network seemed overloaded. No signal. Just a frustrating no-service message mocking my growing panic. That's when the decision solidified in my mind. Lincoln High Gym. It sounded insane, desperate, but it was a direction, a plan, something to grasp onto in the swirling vortex of chaos. Anything had to be better than hiding alone in a flimsy dorm room. A reinforced building surrounded by other people. Maybe, just maybe, there was safety in numbers. Just as I made up my mind, my phone buzzed again. Another emergency alert. Emergency alert. The red banner screamed. Official shelter at Lincoln High School GYM. Avoid exposed areas. The second alert, the confirmation of the location, solidified my resolve. It wasn't just a rumor. It was official. Someone, somewhere, was taking charge, trying to organize some semblance of order in this unfolding nightmare. Without another thought, I dashed out into the late afternoon sun, joining a small, surging stream of frantic individuals heading in the same direction. The air outside was warm, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows, but even the familiar comfort of daylight felt wrong. Like a veil had been drawn over the city, muting the colors, dimming the vibrancy. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising tide of panic. Each breath felt shallow, ragged. I could feel the pulse throbbing in my temples, a painful reminder of the escalating terror gripping the city. As we hurried down the street, scanning alleyways and side streets, the unsettling quiet was punctuated by fragmented sounds, the screech of tires, the shattering of glass, distant, muffled screams. Abandoned cars littered the streets at odd angles, doors flung open, as if their drivers had simply vanished mid-journey. Storefront windows were smashed, displays of mannequins and merchandise spilling onto the sidewalks. But the real horror wasn't in the wreckage. It was in the distance. Far down the street, moving in the periphery of my vision, were silhouettes. They moved oddly, jerky, uneven gaits, limbs twisting at unnatural angles. They weren't running, not exactly, but they were moving with a disturbing, relentless purpose. My breath hitched, my eyes strained, trying to make sense of the distant figures. They were too far away to make out details, but their movements were wrong, unfamiliar, like their bodies were betraying them, puppets with tangled strings. We moved faster, our small group tightening, each person instinctively drawing closer to the others for some semblance of protection. Ears perked, we scanned every alleyway, every side street, listening for any sound that might indicate something lurking in the shadows. The closer we got to Lincoln High, the quieter we became, as if afraid our voices, our very presence, would draw unwelcome attention. By the time we reached the Lincoln High campus, I was drenched in sweat, my lungs burning, each breath a painful rasp. A chain-link fence, normally an unremarkable barrier, now seemed like a fragile lifeline, separating us from what waited beyond those fences. A small gate in the fence was slightly ajar, and as we approached, I saw them volunteers. A handful of people wearing bright reflective vests or armbands, standing guard, ushering people inside. A small beacon of order in the overwhelming chaos. They performed quick, cursory checks as people streamed through the narrow gate, mostly glancing for obvious injuries, like scratches or bites. The implication was chillingly clear. An older woman with tired eyes, her face etched with worry lines that seemed to deepen with each new arrival, pulled me aside. She shone a small flashlight in my face, her gaze sharp and assessing. "You look all right," she said, her voice hoarse but firm, offering me a bottle of water. "No bites or scratches?" The question hung in the air, stark and terrifying. Bites, scratches, as if that was how. I shook my head, numbly accepting the water, thoroughly unsettled by the question. "Have there been?" I started to ask, the words catching in my throat, unable to articulate the horrific question forming in my mind. The medic just nodded grimly, her gaze unwavering, and waved me forward. "Jim's that way," she said, her voice low. "Stay calm, calm." The word felt like a cruel joke. Calm was an impossible luxury in this moment of unfolding terror. But I nodded again, pushing down the rising panic, and moved towards the gym. The Lincoln High Gym was larger than I remembered from the one time I'd been there for a local fundraiser years ago. Now it was transformed into a makeshift shelter, a chaotic sanctuary. Rows of cots and foldable chairs were crammed together in a haphazard arrangement, consuming nearly every inch of floor space. Families huddled together, clinging to each other for comfort, their faces pale and drawn. Lone individuals, like myself, drifted uncertainly to the edges, leaning against the cold gym walls for support, lost in their own private islands of fear. The bleachers were partially folded out, creating cramped, tiered seating areas, where small groups whispered in hushed voices, their conversations punctuated by anxious glances and nervous fidgeting. Dozens of faces, all reflecting a universal sense of dread, turned towards me as I walked in, their eyes searching, questioning, mirroring my own fear. A volunteer stationed at the entrance, a young man with a weary but determined expression, gestured for me to find a cot on the right side, near the basketball hoops. I picked an open spot with a thin, flimsy-looking sleeping mat and gratefully dropped my backpack onto it. I tried to take in my surroundings, to anchor myself in this chaotic new reality. Emergency supply boxes, stacked and labeled, lined the gym walls, a promise of dwindling resources. People cradled water bottles and small packages of food, their eyes darting nervously to the supply boxes, unsure how long these meager rations were supposed to last. Suddenly, a shrill beep cut through the hushed tension, drawing everyone's attention. A volunteer, carrying a megaphone, stepped onto a makeshift platform near the basketball court. "Attention!" His voice echoed through the gym, amplified but still strained. "Attention! This shelter is authorized by local officials to provide protection and resources. We have limited food, limited water, and some medical supplies. Please listen for further announcements and remain calm." A ripple of murmured responses spread through the crowd, a wave of anxious whispers and nervous coughs. The volunteer lowered his megaphone, stepping down from the platform, and began talking quietly with a group of people wearing matching armbands. Volunteers, organizers, people in charge, but even these figures of authority, seemed uncertain, their faces etched with worry, their eyes reflecting the same fear as everyone else. That alone was disheartening, a stark realization that no one truly knew what was happening. No one had a real plan. If they felt as frightened and uncertain as the rest of us, what hope did we really have? Outside, the sun was setting, its last rays filtering through the high windows of the gym, painting long, distorted shadows on the polished floor. The combination of hushed panic, the fading light, and the stifling air made the entire space feel like the opening scene of a nightmare. One we couldn't wake up from, one we were trapped inside. That first night in the gym stretched into an eternity. Around midnight, the main overhead lights flickered and died, plunging the gym into near darkness. To conserve power, they said, leaving only a handful of portable lanterns scattered across the vast space, casting pools of weak, yellow light and deepening the already pervasive shadows. Tiny clusters of survivors huddled together, whispering quietly, reluctant to sleep, as if sleep itself was a vulnerability, an invitation for the unknown horrors to creep closer. I tried to rest, lying stiffly on the thin mat, but found myself jolted awake by the smallest sounds. The clang of a folding chair somewhere in the darkness, a distant hacking cough, the rustle of plastic bags as someone shifted on their cot. Each sound, amplified in the oppressive silence, sent my nerves further on edge. Sometime in the dead of night, a phone alert buzzed in unison across multiple devices, a chilling electronic chorus. "Emergency alert." The screen glared. Zombie activity increased. "Stay indoors." The low, mournful wail of the alert tone reverberated through the dark gym, sending fresh waves of dread through those who were still awake, amplifying the fear that clung to the air like a suffocating blanket. I found myself shivering despite the stuffy warmth of the gym. Was it adrenaline? Exhaustion? Both, probably. A volunteer, his face pale and drawn in the lantern light, made slow rounds, trying to offer reassurance, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's all right," he murmured. his eyes darting nervously towards the gym doors. "We have the fence. We have watchers stationed around the building. Just keep calm." His words might have been comforting if his own eyes hadn't betrayed his own fear, wide and haunted, reflecting the same terror gripping us all. Eventually, sheer fatigue overpowered my anxiety, and I drifted into a fitful, shallow doze. But my dreams were haunted, a flickering reel of disturbing images. Faces pressed against the chain-link fence, contorted features contorted in grotesque snarls, twisted hands clawing, scratching at doors, desperate to get in. I jerked awake with a gasp, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure the people on the neighboring cots could hear it. Morning arrived sluggishly, seeping into the gym through the dusty windows in a muted, depressing gray. Despite the early hour, the gym was already stirring, alive with stressed, hushed conversations. Volunteers, their faces drawn and weary, were setting up stations near the entrance to distribute the day's rations. A half bottle of water here, a single energy bar, or a small can of vegetables there. Meager offerings, but in this new reality, precious commodities. I queued up, feeling a pang of guilt for taking food when supplies were obviously so tight. We were told to conserve everything, to avoid unnecessary movement. They didn't want too many people going in and out of the building, especially given the warnings about increased zombie activity. Zombie activity. The word still felt unreal, like a morbid joke, but the gnawing fear in my stomach was starkly, terrifyingly real. Curiosity, a dangerous impulse in such a precarious situation, nudged me to explore. After receiving my rations, I wandered around the gym, taking mental notes, trying to map out this strange, temporary world. A medical area had been hastily set up in a corner, a folding table draped with a stained sheet serving as a makeshift first aid station, a curtained-off space offering a semblance of privacy for more critical issues. The bleachers were partially occupied by families who had tried to create small pockets of privacy with blankets and sheets, fragile barriers against the pervasive fear. Near the double doors, a small group of younger volunteers clustered together, their hushed conversation punctuated by nervous gestures. Supply run, grocery store, outdoor goods, backup generator. Fragments of their whispered plans drifted to me, hinting at the precarious efforts being made to keep us alive. In a small alcove off the main gym floor, I spotted a volunteer organizing a haphazard pile of donated clothes. I hesitated, then approached him. "Hi," I said, my voice raspy from disuse. I'm new here." He looked up, a flicker of something akin to a smile briefly softening the worry lines around his eyes. "James," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, reassuring. He had a kind face, but even kindness seemed overshadowed by the weight of worry pressing down on him. "They told us to conserve everything," I said, gesturing vaguely at the supply boxes lining the wall. James sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "We've tried contacting nearby stores for supplies," he explained, his voice low and strained. "But phone lines are unreliable, and it seems like no official rescue is forthcoming." He paused, his gaze drifting to the gym doors, as if listening for something, some sound from the outside that might offer a clue, some sign of hope. "We're on our own for now," he murmured, folding a worn jacket with slow, deliberate movements. "We need to make sure people don't panic. Fear spreads faster than anything else." I nodded, swallowing hard, the lump of fear in my own chest already swelling, threatening to spill over. Panic was bubbling beneath the surface, a volatile undercurrent in the hushed tension of the gym. I just hadn't let it break free yet. Not yet. That afternoon, the tension in the gym thickened, becoming almost palpable. 2 volunteer teams prepared to depart on small supply runs. One team, heading towards a local grocery store, the other towards an outdoor goods retailer rumored to have a backup generator. Their departure was met with a mix of emotions: relief, hope, but also a heavy dose of fear. If they returned successfully, we'd have more resources, a sliver of hope to cling to. If they didn't, we'd be down even more capable hands, even more vulnerable. Worried whispers spread through the gym, weaving through the rows of cots like a chilling draft. Some folks claimed they had heard scratching at the fence during the night, a persistent, unsettling sound that spoke of unseen threats lurking just beyond our fragile perimeter. Others insisted the perimeter was secure, that it was just the wind, the rustling of leaves. A new, even more disturbing rumor began to circulate that someone in the gym had been bitten, had been injured, and was hiding it, afraid to reveal the truth. The story changed with each retelling, morphing, distorting, becoming more gruesome and terrifying with every hushed whisper. But it fueled a simmering paranoia, a creeping distrust that poisoned the already fragile sense of community. A middle-aged man sitting near me, his face gaunt and unshaven, muttered under his breath, his eyes darting around suspiciously. "If anyone's hiding that they were bitten," he hissed, his voice barely audible, "they'll turn, and then we're done for." He glanced around as if expecting to spot the infected person lurking amongst us, ready to unleash chaos at any second. No official announcements were made to address these rumors. No attempts to quell the rising tide of paranoia. And that silence, that lack of reassurance, only amplified the anxiety, letting fear fester and grow in the confined space of the gym. The volunteers tried to keep everyone calm, offering weak smiles and hollow platitudes, but we could sense they were just as overwhelmed, just as terrified as the rest of us. Every so often, someone's phone would chime with a new alert, a fresh wave of electronic dread. But they offered little comfort, just more of the same, recycled warnings, empty instructions. "Emergency alert!" The red banner flared. "Continue to shelter in place." "Emergency alert!" Another message chimed in a few hours later. "Help is delayed. Help is delayed." The phrase echoed in my mind. A stark, brutal understatement. Helplessness settled over us. A heavy, suffocating blanket. We had no timeline. No sense of what was happening beyond the chain-link fence, beyond the walls of the gym. The best we could do was trust that those flimsy barriers would hold, that the locked doors would remain secure, and that whatever waited outside wouldn't find a way in. A fragile hope in the face of overwhelming fear. The second night mirrored the first, endless, suffocating. The gym lights were again switched off, plunging us into near darkness, punctuated only by the weak glow of the scattered lanterns. I curled up on my thin sleeping mat, adjusting my backpack to serve as a makeshift pillow, the stale air thick with the smell of disinfectant mixed with the growing odor of unwashed bodies and the pervasive scent of anxiety. A nearby group, their voices hushed but persistent, talked in whispers, not even attempting to sleep. They were young, maybe high schoolers themselves, who had taken shelter here before their families were split up, their hushed voices carrying a gloom that felt far too heavy for their age. Their conversation, fragments of memories of normal life, only amplified the stark contrast of our current reality. Another beep from my phone, battery dangerously low, but the dim display showed a new text message. "We're okay," it read. "Text if you can." It was from my parents. Relief, sharp and overwhelming, washed over me, momentarily pushing back the tide of fear. They were alive. They were okay. I quickly typed a reply, my fingers fumbling in my haste. "At Lincoln High, safe for now." But the message refused to send. No signal. The familiar, mocking message flashed across the screen. Network congestion? Signal jammed? It didn't matter. It was gone. I tried a few more times, desperation rising, but the message stubbornly refused to send. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and frustrated. The phone's battery icon blinked, a grim reminder that time was running out, not just for my phone, but for everything. Unable to rest, restless with fear and a gnawing sense of isolation, I decided to walk quietly around the gym perimeter, just to clear my head, to find some semblance of solitude in the crowded chaos. I slipped between rows of cots, careful not to startle the sleeping or half-sleeping forms huddled beneath thin blankets. Near the back exit, in a shadowy corner, I found a volunteer named Sarah. She was pacing restlessly, flashlight beam dancing nervously across the floor. She recognized me from earlier. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. I shook my head. Sarah confided that the volunteers had received a partial radio transmission, crackling and fragmented, about possible safe zones miles away, upstate, they thought. But no one could confirm if they were legitimate, if it was just static or wishful thinking. The city, or so the rumor went, was on lockdown, completely cut off. Sarah was torn, her face etched with exhaustion and indecision, about whether to try leading a group out, to attempt the trek north in the desperate hope of finding real security, of reaching those rumored safe zones. But that meant navigating potentially dangerous streets we knew might be crawling with the threat beyond understanding. We have kids here, she said, her voice breaking slightly, pointing her flashlight towards a section of the gym where families were asleep, huddled together like fragile birds. And elderly folks too. If we take them outside, can we protect them? Are we better off staying put and hoping for a real rescue that might never come? I had no good answer. No one did. We lingered there in the shadows, listening to the night sounds, the faint wind rustling through the chain-link fence. Every now and then, the metal links made a soft clinking sound, like someone or something was testing them, probing our fragile defenses. Eventually, I shuffled back to my cot, my mind whirling with questions that had no immediate solutions, no easy answers. I lay awake, half drifting in that liminal space between conscious fear and restless dreams, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me like a physical burden. As the days blurred together, the routine settled into a bizarre, unsettling pattern. We rose with the gray dawn, collected our meager rations, attended to any tasks that needed doing, organizing supplies, cleaning small areas of the gym, trying to maintain some semblance of order in the face of encroaching chaos. The volunteers rotated shifts to guard the entrances, though guard was a strong word for people armed only with improvised tools, a baseball bat, a metal pipe, a fire extinguisher, woefully inadequate against whatever was out there. Those volunteers who returned from supply runs, their faces pale and haunted, brought back harrowing tales of what they'd witnessed beyond the gym fences. One group claimed they had encountered actual chaos on the streets of vehicles blocking roads at crazy angles, eerie, shambling figures haunting empty storefronts, the chilling silence broken only by their unsettling moans. Another group spoke of witnessing neighbors, people they knew, turned into pale shadows of themselves, moving with jerky, unnatural gaits, their eyes vacant, lifeless. Though no one wanted to describe them in detail, to speak the word zombie aloud. The unspoken terror hung heavy in the air. Whenever I asked about casualties, about what they had actually seen, the volunteers clammed up, their eyes dropping to the floor, their silence speaking volumes. Their averted gazes, their tight-lipped expressions, were enough to confirm that things went poorly, terribly poorly, outside. Inside the gym, frustration simmered. A low, constant hum of discontent. People formed tight-knit clusters, hesitant to trust strangers in the next row of cots, suspicion and paranoia slowly eroding the fragile community. Some folks argued that we should consolidate resources more aggressively, take charge with a real plan, establish a hierarchy, enforce order. Others insisted we maintain democracy, that every voice should be heard before major decisions, clinging to the remnants of a world where individual rights still mattered. Tensions erupted over the dwindling rations, over rationing policies. Once, I witnessed a shouting match over a missing bottle of water, escalating quickly, voices rising, fueled by hunger and fear, until a volunteer had to intervene, stepping between them, his own voice strained with exhaustion, before it escalated further. Amidst all this internal turmoil, the phone alerts kept coming. Though less frequently now, the electronic pronouncements becoming sparser, more repetitive, as if whoever was sending them had nothing new to offer, just blanket instructions, repeated over an empty airwave. Emergency alert. Flashed the red banner. Quarantine in effect. Emergency alert. Another message chimed in a few hours later. Remain in shelter. The messages felt hollow, distant, as though whoever was behind them had abandoned us, left us to fend for ourselves, offering only recycled platitudes of safety. Lincoln High wasn't just a gym. It was a whole complex of hallways, classrooms, administrative offices, a silent, echoing labyrinth beyond the relative openness of the gym. Early on, the volunteers had tried to keep everyone contained to the gym, to maintain some semblance of control, but rumors spread like wildfire of extra supplies hidden in the locked cafeteria, untouched reserves of food and water, or even the science labs, rumored to contain emergency medical kits, forgotten first aid supplies. Driven by desperation and fueled by rumors, a couple of adventurous individuals, mostly younger survivors, slipped away at night to search, hoping to find a hidden cache of resources, a lifeline in our dwindling situation. Most returned empty-handed, spooked by the silent, echoing corridors, the locked doors, the oppressive darkness beyond the gym walls. One night, as I lay restless on my cot, I heard a faint tapping sound, emanating from somewhere beyond the gym's back exit. It was a slow, inconsistent rhythm, 3 taps, a pause for taps, then silence. My curiosity, a reckless, potentially fatal impulse, overrode my caution. I tiptoed away from my cot, heart pounding, and pressed my ear to the heavy metal door that separated us from a rear corridor. All I could make out was a soft shuffle, a faint rustling sound, and occasional breathing, or what sounded like breathing labored, uneven. I wondered if it was a volunteer on patrol, checking the perimeter. Summoning my nerve, I cracked the door open, just an inch, peering into the dimly lit corridor. It was eerily silent, illuminated only by the weak, flickering glow of a single emergency light affixed to the wall. Rows of lockers lined the walls, their metal doors painted a dull, institutional gray, casting long, distorted shadows in the weak light. "Hello," I called out in a hushed voice, barely a whisper. "Anyone there?" No answer. Only the faint echo of my own words bouncing back from the empty corridor. My pulse pounded in my ears, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. After about a minute, holding my breath, straining to hear anything, any sound beyond the silence, I decided to let it be, to retreat back into the relative safety of the gym. Wandering around alone in this dark, echoing labyrinth hardly seemed wise. Still, that tapping sound replayed in my thoughts long after I returned to my cot, a persistent, unsettling rhythm. It felt like a warning, a coded message, or perhaps just a sign that we weren't alone in the building, that something else was out there, beyond the gym walls, beyond our understanding. We were in the gym for what felt like forever, time blurring into a monotonous cycle of fear and dwindling hope. But in reality, it might have only been a few days, maybe a week at most. Time lost all meaning under the harsh fluorescent lamps, the days and nights blending together into a seamless, suffocating whole. With each passing hour, more issues surfaced, compounding the already dire situation. Water began running critically low, making sanitation a real problem. The few functioning toilets, already overburdened, became increasingly unsanitary, the stench of untreated waste starting to creep into the air. Another layer of discomfort, another assault on our dwindling morale. Volunteers tried to keep the place clean, using what little disinfectant they had, but it felt like a losing battle. Morale was plummeting, sinking faster than the dwindling water level. Arguments became more frequent, sharper, fueled by hunger, thirst, and the crushing weight of despair. Some insisted we should relocate, attempt a desperate trek to a rumored military base upstate, a phantom sanctuary mentioned in hushed whispers, though no one had any proof it was safe or even real. Others argued that leaving the gym would be suicide, venturing out into the unknown horrors beyond our fragile walls. One day, Sarah gathered a group of about a dozen survivors near the gym entrance. I joined them out of a mixture of curiosity and a desperate yearning for any kind of plan, any glimmer of hope. They were discussing whether to attempt a long trek north, based on that stray radio transmission, that fragmented whisper of a fortified camp, a sanctuary somewhere beyond the city limits. The group was evenly split, a microcosm of the larger gym population, between those who believed it was our best, perhaps only hope, and those who were paralyzed by terror at the thought of stepping outside, of facing the unknown dangers that lurked beyond the fence. During the meeting, James stood up, his voice quavering, but firm with conviction. "Look," he said, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the small circle. "I've been outside on 3 supply runs now. Each time we lost people. The streets aren't normal anymore. Whatever is out there, it's relentless. We barely made it back. I hate feeling like a prisoner. I hate this waiting. But at least these walls, these fences offer some protection. At least here we're still alive." A middle-aged woman, her face etched with a weariness that mirrored James's own, responded, her voice tight with desperation. "Walls won't save us if we run out of supplies. And we are running out. It's only a matter of time before hunger forces us out. Staying here is just a slower death." They continued arguing in circles, voices rising and falling, hope battling against despair, logic clashing with fear. The outcome of the discussion was inconclusive, mirroring the paralyzing indecision that gripped us all. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that any organized escape plan, any coordinated attempt to reach that rumored sanctuary, was unlikely. People were too frightened, too divided, too broken to agree on a course of action. We were trapped, not just by the fences and locked doors, but by our own fear, our own fractured community. A few days after we arrived, or maybe it was longer, time had lost all meaning. A volunteer named Marcus, a young man known for his quiet competence and steady nerves, led a fresh supply run. This time, they aimed for a chain pharmacy on the other side of town, rumored to have leftover essentials, medicine, bandages, maybe even some forgotten food supplies. He picked his volunteers carefully, selecting people who could run fast, who weren't easily spooked, people with a desperate kind of courage born of dwindling options. They left at dawn, promising to return by nightfall. Their departure met with a strained silence, a fragile hope clinging to the edges of despair. We pinned our remaining hopes on them. If they found medicine, food, maybe even a generator, it could sustain us longer, buy us more time in this increasingly desperate situation. As day turned to evening, worried glances kept flicking towards the gym's entrance, each creak of the doors, each rustle of the fence, drawing nervous attention. By sunset, they weren't back. By midnight, the tension in the gym was so thick you could practically feel it, a suffocating weight pressing down on us all. A volunteer, his voice strained but trying to sound reassuring, tried to calm everyone, explaining that maybe they had taken shelter elsewhere, found a safer building, or were hiding until it was safe to return. But the unspoken fear, the chilling certainty, was that something had gone terribly wrong outside, that Marcus and his team had met with whatever waited beyond our fragile sanctuary. The fence rattled more persistently than usual that night, a constant, unnerving tremor that seemed to vibrate through the very floor of the gym. I stared up at the high windows, seeing only impenetrable darkness beyond the glass. Yet I sensed shapes out there, unseen presences pressing against our last line of defense, testing its strength. My nerves were raw, frayed, and I wasn't alone. People paced restlessly, or huddled together in small, anxious groups, eyes darting at every small noise, every creak, every rustle. When the chain-link fence rattled again, louder, more violent this time, the hushed gym fell into absolute silence. Time seemed frozen, stretched thin with anticipation and dread. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the clattering subsided, the rattling fading into a low, unsettling tremor. But it left behind a collective dread that only grew stronger with each passing hour, a certainty that our fragile sanctuary was under siege. That same night, the generator we'd been relying on, our last link to normalcy, started to sputter, its fuel nearly depleted, coughing and wheezing like a dying beast. We relied on it primarily to power the gym's overhead lights, along with a few small appliances in the makeshift medical area. Without it, we would be plunged into near total darkness, save for the flickering glow of battery lanterns and flashlights, losing even the illusion of safety that the harsh fluorescent lights had provided. Close to 2 a.m., a sharp crack echoed through the darkened corridors, ripping through the hushed silence, like something heavy had fallen or been violently knocked over. A flurry of movement ensued. Volunteers, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, rushed to see if we were under attack, if the perimeter had been breached. I crept along behind them, my heart hammering against my ribs, adrenaline surging through my veins. We found a toppled metal shelf near the cafeteria doors, a heavy pantry shelf that had been used to store some of the remaining canned goods. Cans and packages were strewn across the floor, scattered amongst toppled chairs and fallen debris. Yet no one was there, no volunteer, no survivor, no one to claim responsibility for the fallen shelf. Could it have been an animal? A stray dog? A desperate raccoon? Or something else? Something that had gotten inside. The volunteers searched the area with strained expressions, their flashlight beams darting nervously into the shadows. They discovered no obvious breaches, no signs of forced entry, but the incident left everyone unsettled, the sense of unease deepening. We fortified the cafeteria doors as best we could, hauling nearby furniture, pushing heavy trash cans against them, creating a makeshift barricade, a fragile barrier against an unseen threat. Afterwards, as people slowly, reluctantly, returned to the gym, I noticed a long smear on the wall near the cafeteria doors. It was dark, reddish-brown, and it stretched down the wall like a stain, like a trail of something. It might have been rust, an old stain, years of grime accumulated on the institutional walls, hard to tell in the weak lantern light, in the shadows that clung to every corner. But it filled me with unease, a creeping sense of decay, of contamination. The entire building, our sanctuary, felt as though it were slowly falling apart from the inside out, crumbling not from external attack, but from an internal rot, a decay of hope, a disintegration of morale. In the days that followed, or what remained of them, the population in the gym thinned, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably. Some cots were left empty, the thin sheets rumpled and hastily abandoned, a silent testament to someone's desperate flight. No official announcements were made about these disappearances. No explanations offered. We could only guess, whisper amongst ourselves, that they had tried to escape at night, slipping out into the darkness, or found some other part of the sprawling school complex to hide in, seeking a solitude that was perhaps more terrifying than the crowded gym. Others, we suspected, might have been quietly ill, succumbing to some unseen sickness, sneaking away so as not to draw attention to themselves, to avoid becoming a source of fear and paranoia. This climate of uncertainty, of unspoken losses and hidden anxieties, fueled distrust, poisoning the already fragile sense of community. A group of about 10 people, led by an outspoken man named Drew, a gruff, imposing figure who had always been vocal about his distrust of the volunteers, banded together, forming a separate faction within the gym. They claimed they didn't feel safe sharing resources with everyone, that the gym was too exposed, too vulnerable. They wanted to barricade themselves in the locker rooms, taking supplies for their exclusive group, hoarding what little we had left. Sarah and James, their faces drawn with exhaustion but their resolve unwavering, attempted to mediate, to reason with Drew, warning him that splitting from the main group would lead to fragmentation, that division would only weaken us all. But Drew wouldn't be swayed, his eyes hard with a desperate kind of self-preservation. A tense standoff occurred in front of everyone in the gym, a silent battle of wills, a microcosm of the larger societal breakdown. In the end, Drew and his followers stormed off, their faces grim, their steps determined, carrying what supplies they could grab. They disappeared behind the gym's far doors, the heavy metal doors clanging shut behind them, leaving everyone else in stunned silence, a silence heavy with apprehension. For the next day or so, we heard them rummaging in the locker rooms, the sounds echoing faintly through the gym walls, pushing around benches, dragging furniture, maybe stacking them against the doors of their self-imposed fortress. Tensions only grew, a palpable divide cleaving the gym in two. Now we had two factions in one building, each suspicious of the other, each clinging to their dwindling resources, each preparing for a separate, isolated survival. With so little food, so little water, arguments, confrontations seemed inevitable. Amidst the encroaching chaos, I found a sort of fragile companionship with Sarah, James, and a few others who remained dedicated to the fading ideal of communal survival, a desperate clinging to the remnants of humanity. We'd gather late at night, after the lanterns were dimmed, sharing small bits of hope, whispering memories of life before the alert, before the world turned upside down. Often, inevitably, the conversation turned to deeper fears, unspoken anxieties that haunted us all. What if rescue never arrived? What if this was it? What if we were truly alone? One evening, we sat in a small circle on the gym floor, flashlights pointed downward to avoid attracting unnecessary attention. The low hum of the dying generator droning in the background, a mournful soundtrack to our dwindling hope. James voiced a thought that had clearly been gnawing at him, a terrifying realization that amplified all our unspoken fears. What if this isn't isolated to our city? He murmured, his voice barely audible above the generator's drone. The phone alerts. They never mention specific regions anymore. They just say to remain in shelter. Could this be nationwide? A heavy silence followed his question, a silence thick with unspoken dread. We'd all considered that possibility, the terrifying implication that the crisis was far larger than just our city, but we tried to avoid thinking about the broader implications, the overwhelming hopelessness of a nationwide or even global catastrophe. If the crisis was everywhere, if the entire world was collapsing, what chance did we really have? Sarah swallowed hard, forcing a weak, brittle smile, a brave attempt to inject some semblance of hope into the crushing despair. We stick together, she said, her voice wavering slightly. That's our chance. Her words, though earnest, though spoken with a desperate conviction, felt hollow, flimsy, inadequate in the vastness of our uncertainty, in the face of the overwhelming dread pressing down on us all. Desperation peaked when we ran critically low on water. The sinks in the locker rooms and bathrooms still dribbled a meager liquid, but it was barely a trickle, and the water pressure seemed to drop with each passing day, each dwindling hour. We had no way of knowing whether it was safe to drink unboiled tap water, whether the city's filtration system still functioned, or if we were poisoning ourselves with every precious sip. A second volunteer team, even smaller than the first, more desperate, decided to head to a major supermarket on the other side of town, a larger, more distant target, a desperate gamble for a bigger reward. Their departure was solemn, somber. Instead of hopeful send-offs, all we could do was glance away, avoid their eyes, knowing the odds weren't in their favor, knowing it was more likely they wouldn't return than they would. They didn't come back that night, or the next. Eventually, after another day of agonizing waiting, of strained silence and forced optimism, we stopped expecting them. The fragile hope extinguished, replaced by a leaden certainty of loss. The anguish on the remaining volunteers' faces, the averted gazes, the tight-lipped silence, told us everything. We had no more illusions that outside runs could reliably save us, no more desperate hopes for rescue. By this time, the gym truly felt like a prison, a stifling, suffocating cage. Chairs, boxes, and debris cluttered every corner, creating a chaotic maze of obstacles. A stale odor of unwashed bodies, spilled food, and hopelessness lingered in the air, clinging to the fabric of the building, seeping into our clothes, into our very skin. The tension with Drew's group in the locker rooms escalated, the silent distrust growing into occasional shouting matches through the closed doors, angry voices echoing through the gym. They claimed the main area was compromised, contaminated, and refused to share their resources, hoarding their stolen supplies jealously, guarding their fragile sanctuary with a fierce paranoia. They even posted guards, fellow survivors, their faces grim, their eyes narrowed with suspicion, who glared at anyone who came too close to their barricaded doors, their silent hostility a constant, unnerving presence. Meanwhile, outside, beyond the gym walls, the fences groaned more often, the rattling becoming more persistent, more violent. We couldn't tell if it was just the wind, the storm gathering on the horizon, or something else, something heavier, something more purposeful pushing against them from inside, from whatever lurked beyond our fragile perimeter. It sounded like an ongoing attempt to break in, a relentless siege, day and night, with no respite, no end in sight. Once, while nervously checking the perimeter doors, peering through the small, grimy windows, I glimpsed a shape outside in the encroaching dusk. I couldn't fully discern what it was, just a fleeting figure moving erratically near the fence, a dark silhouette against the fading light. It stayed there for a few seconds, motionless, as if sensing me through the small window, its presence radiating a chilling, predatory stillness. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished into the gathering gloom, swallowed by the darkness beyond the fence. That night, I had trouble breathing, a suffocating weight pressing on my chest. Whenever I closed my eyes, all I could see was that fleeting figure at the fence, that dark silhouette against the dying light, the harbinger of something terrible, something inevitable. Time lost all meaning, days and nights indistinguishable in the dim, suffocating gym. We survived on rationed snacks, scavenged odd-canned goods, and miserly sips of water, each swallow a reminder of our dwindling resources, of our precarious existence. The volunteer announcements grew less frequent, their voices more strained, more defeated. Many of them were simply drained of energy, hollowed out by fear and despair. Even the old medic, the woman with tired eyes who had checked me upon arrival, seemed defeated, spending most of her time tending to people with stress-related ailments, dehydration, panic attacks, the unseen wounds of fear. When a volunteer approached her, his arms scratched and bleeding from a scuffle over resources, a petty, desperate squabble, she merely shook her head, her gaze distant, lost in some inner weariness, as if even she, the voice of calm and reason, was unsure how to help anymore, how to offer any real comfort in the face of overwhelming despair. We tried to keep the generator functioning, to cling to the last vestiges of normalcy, running it for a few hours each night, a desperate, futile gesture against the encroaching darkness. But fuel was nearly gone, the reserves dwindling to almost nothing. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the gym floor, it sputtered dangerously, coughing and wheezing, cutting out for several agonizing seconds at a time, plunging us into an abyss of near-total darkness before roaring back to life, spitting and sputtering, its engine protesting with every rotation. Each time it died, even for those fleeting moments of darkness, the gym erupted in panicked murmurs, a collective gasp of fear, a stark reminder of how thin the thread of our survival had become. Every phone left with any battery beeped sporadically, the faint electronic chirps incongruously cheerful in the oppressive gloom, though we received fewer and fewer official messages. Some were just duplicates of older alerts, stuck in a digital loop, endlessly repeating the same hollow warnings. Emergency alert. The red banner flashed. High-risk area. Avoid travel. Emergency alert. Another repeated. Remain in your shelter. Empty pronouncements from a world that felt like it had already forgotten us, abandoned us, left us to fend for ourselves in this shell of a school, this gym that had become our final, fragile stronghold. 3 nights before the gym's downfall, before the final, terrifying descent into chaos, I heard something that still haunts me, that echoes in my nightmares, a sound that stripped away any remaining illusion of safety, any fragile hope that we might somehow survive. A single, piercing scream, echoing down the hallway, sharp, raw, and utterly, unmistakably human. It was a scream filled with such pure, unadulterated terror that my blood ran cold, my breath hitching in my throat, my heart seizing in my chest. I scrambled out of my cot, fumbling blindly for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. Others did the same, jolted awake by the piercing scream, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, creating frantic beams of light that danced across the gym floor. Sarah, James, and a few other volunteers gathered quickly, their faces pale and drawn in the flickering light, shining their beams into the dark corridors, searching for the source of that blood-curdling scream. We never found who screamed. We discovered only a trail of scattered belongings, a shoe lying abandoned in the hallway, a fallen flashlight casting a weak beam against the wall, a crushed, discarded water bottle, its contents spilled across the floor, leading towards a side door that stood slightly ajar, swaying gently in the still air. Beyond it, a pitch-black hallway awaited, silent except for a faint drip of water from leaky pipes, an unsettlingly mundane sound in the face of such profound terror. We retreated hastily, fear gripping us all, none of us willing to wander too far from the main group, to venture into the unknown darkness alone. The fear among us became palpable, a living, breathing entity. People whispered theories, hushed, frantic speculations. Did someone try to escape, to flee into the night? Did they encounter an intruder, something that had breached our fragile defenses? Our imaginations spiraled into dark, terrifying scenarios, amplified by the oppressive darkness and the lingering echo of that scream. That same night, the chain-link fence rattled more violently than ever before, a relentless assault on our senses, on our already frayed nerves. Some survivors huddled together in tight groups, covering their ears with their hands, desperate to block out the dreadful noise, the incessant clattering, the grinding metal. Others paced anxiously, their movements jerky, their eyes wide with panic, fiddling nervously with any object at hand, their frayed nerves stretched to the breaking point. A child cried in the darkness, her sobs echoing in the stillness, a small sound of utter despair that amplified the overwhelming dread gripping us all. 2 days later, 2 days of dwindling hope and mounting terror, tension with Drew's group hit a breaking point, a violent, inevitable eruption. They stormed out of the locker rooms, their faces grim, their eyes desperate, demanding more blankets, more water, their voices harsh and accusatory. The confrontation escalated quickly, fueled by hunger, thirst, paranoia, and the crushing weight of despair. When one of Drew's followers shoved a volunteer who stood in their way, blocking their path, it was the spark that ignited the tinderbox. Within moments, shouts erupted, accusations flew, and a chaotic melee broke out in the middle of the gym, a desperate, brutal struggle in the dim lantern light. We scrambled to intervene, Sarah and James, and a few others, rushing into the chaotic fray, desperate to stop the violence, to restore some semblance of order before it spiraled completely out of control. Sarah tried to mediate, stepping between the two sides, arms raised in a plea for calm, her voice strained, pleading for reason. James attempted to talk sense to Drew, his voice urgent, trying to appeal to whatever humanity remained in the man. But Drew was too far gone, lost in his own fear, his own paranoia, driven by hunger and desperation. Drew, his face red with fury, his eyes wild and desperate, spat accusations, his voice raw with anger. "You volunteers," he roared. "You're hoarding resources. You're letting us rot in here. Staying in this gym is a death sentence." The argument escalated, voices rising, insults flying, until Drew, his face contorted with fury, roared a final, desperate pronouncement. "I'd rather take my chances outside," he screamed, his voice echoing through the gym, "than rot in here." With that, he and his group, their faces grim, their movements jerky, snatched extra supplies from the nearby boxes, ignoring Sarah's desperate pleas to cooperate, to think rationally. Before we could fully react, before anyone could stop them, they rushed towards a side exit door, one of the rarely used emergency exits, forcibly unlocking it, throwing the heavy metal door open with a clang that echoed through the gym. Alarms wailed for a moment, a jarring electronic shriek in the chaos, but the group pushed onward, determined, desperate to flee into the unknown terrors of the world outside, to escape the perceived prison of the gym. We watched, stunned, horrified, as they disappeared beyond the fence perimeter, their figures swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Some carried improvised weapons, bats, pipes, sharpened sticks, pathetic defenses against whatever awaited them. Others clutched backpacks stuffed with stolen provisions, their faces grim masks of fear and desperation. Their fate was unknown, a terrifying blank space in our dwindling hope. The door they broke open, that emergency exit, was never properly secured again, a gaping wound in our defenses, leaving a critical gap in our fragile perimeter. Eventually, inevitably, the day came when we ran out of generator fuel altogether, the final, agonizing depletion. Volunteers had tried every trick, every desperate measure, siphoning fuel from abandoned vehicles outside the fence, searching hidden supply closets in the school's labyrinthine corridors, every frantic effort ending in failure. Now we faced the final evening, the ultimate descent into darkness, with only battery lanterns and flashlights, our last flickering sources of light, our last tenuous hold on normalcy. A single line of overhead lights, connected to some reserve power source, flickered intermittently, casting eerie, jumping shadows across the gym, more unsettling than comforting. It might have been more merciful to have total darkness than to endure the strobe-like flicker, the erratic dance of light and shadow that preyed on our already frayed nerves. People gathered in tense clusters, their faces pale and drawn in the flickering light, too anxious to sleep, too terrified to rest. Some whispered short prayers, their voices barely audible above the hushed tension, seeking solace and faith, clinging to the last vestiges of hope. Others tried to console one another with empty words of reassurance, hollow platitudes that offered no real comfort. Still others stared blankly at the floor, their eyes lost in a vast emptiness of despair, their spirits already broken, surrendered to the inevitable. Outside, a storm threatened, the air thick with humidity, heavy with the promise of rain. We heard distant thunder rumbling on the horizon, a low, ominous growl that seemed to echo the dread in our own hearts. But no rain fell, not yet, just sporadic flashes of lightning that illuminated the fence in stark, momentary bursts of white light. In one such flash, brief and terrifying, I thought I saw figures pressing against the chain link, arms outstretched, skeletal limbs reaching through the mesh, as if drawn to the flickering light of the gym, moths to a dying flame. The silhouette vanished when darkness returned, swallowed by the shadows, but the image burned itself into my mind, seared into my consciousness, a terrifying premonition of what was to come. Sometime around midnight, when the storm was drawing closer, when the air was thick with the smell of ozone and the promise of rain, the generator sputtered its final, agonizing breath. The overhead lights dimmed, pulsed once, twice, then died completely, plunging the gym into absolute, impenetrable darkness, broken only by the trembling, inadequate glow of a few battery lanterns, scattered beacons of fragility in the overwhelming blackness. Not long after the generator died, after the final, echoing silence settled over the gym, the most ominous phone alert of all rang out, a chilling electronic death knell, on the few devices still clinging to battery life, their screens flickering weakly in the darkness. Emergency alert! The red banner flared one last time. Immediate shelter no longer available. It repeated twice, the stark, brutal message echoing through the gym, then fell silent, the screens fading to black, leaving us in complete and utter darkness. The words sank like lead in our chests, heavy, suffocating, crushing the last vestiges of hope. Did it mean rescue efforts were officially called off? That no safe havens remained? That we were truly, finally, alone? As if to confirm our worst fears, a new sound erupted from outside, ripping through the oppressive silence. A thunderous crash, the unmistakable sound of the chain link fence being hammered, pounded, violently assaulted. Flashlights bobbed frantically in the darkness as volunteers, their voices trembling, rushed to the outer doors, pressing their ears against the cold metal, trying to gauge the extent of the threat, the force of the assault. Some survivors scrambled in panicked frenzy to stack chairs, tables, anything heavy they could find, against potential entry points, desperate to reinforce our fragile defenses. The battered door Drew's group had forced open, now a gaping, unsecured hole in our perimeter, was a glaring weak spot, a terrifying vulnerability. A volunteer's voice quavered in the darkness, barely audible above the rising clamor from outside, his voice choked with terror. "They're coming!" What followed was an eruption of panicked shouting, a chaotic surge of fear that consumed the gym. Families clung to one another, weeping openly, their sobs echoing in the darkness. Some people ran aimlessly around the gym, their flashlight beams dancing wildly across the walls, seeking an escape route that didn't exist, a phantom exit in our inescapable prison. The pounding on the outside walls seemed to grow stronger, more relentless, an escalating drumbeat of doom. It felt like the entire building shook, shuddered with each impact, as if an unstoppable force was finally tearing through our last stand, breaching our final defenses. The floodgates of fear fully opened, unleashing a torrent of panic. A few volunteer leaders, their voices strained but determined, attempted to maintain some semblance of order, shouting for people to move to interior hallways, away from the exposed gym walls, while others desperately tried to secure the main doors, a futile attempt to hold back the inevitable. But the flimsy plan quickly fell apart, dissolving in the chaos, swept away by the rising tide of terror. The moans and scraping sounds from outside grew in volume, more guttural, more insistent, and soon it felt like they were mere feet away, just beyond the doors, just beyond the walls, pressing in, closing in, their presence a palpable, suffocating weight. I looked around, my flashlight beam sweeping across frantic faces illuminated by the trembling glow of scattered lanterns. People tripped over cots, toppling them in their desperate bids to flee, to escape, to find some illusory safety in the chaos. The old medic, her face etched with exhaustion and despair, was trying to guide an injured man, his leg bandaged and bleeding, to a safer spot, to the interior hallways, but the surging mass of frightened survivors separated them, swept them away in the tide of panic. Meanwhile, amidst the chaos, amidst the rising tide of terror, I caught sight of James, his face grim but his eyes still burning with a desperate resolve, leading a small group of survivors towards a side corridor, a shadowed passage that might offer a temporary reprieve, a fleeting sanctuary. He beckoned me over, his hand gesturing urgently, and I forced my shaking legs to move, to push through the panicked crowd, clutching my backpack tight, my knuckles white, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Halfway there, through the surging chaos of the gym floor, I felt the gym doors behind me shudder with a massive impact, a deafening crash that resonated through the entire building. Something had slammed into them, something huge, something relentless, hard enough to bend the metal frames, to buckle the reinforced doors. The doors screeched in protest, hinges straining, metal groaning, the sound of our final defenses failing. Sarah appeared at my side, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror but still focused, still determined. "We have to find a secure room," she shouted over the rising din, her voice trembling but resolute. "We can't stay in the open." Nodding, my throat tight with fear, unable to speak, I followed her, my flashlight beam dancing erratically across the panicked faces around us. Families wept openly, their cries lost in the rising clamor, uncertain where to go, paralyzed by fear. One volunteer, his voice cracking with desperation, urged them towards the locker rooms, Drew's now abandoned fortress, but that area felt compromised, tainted by division and despair. Another volunteer, his face contorted with panic, was banging frantically on a locked staff office door, pleading with whoever was inside to open up, to offer sanctuary, his desperate cries lost in the swelling tide of chaos. Confusion swelled, fear reigned, and no single plan, no coherent strategy, could hold in the face of overwhelming panic. In the swirling vortex of chaos, I stuck to Sarah and James, clinging to their presence as a lifeline, a fragile anchor in the storm. We managed to guide a small cluster of terrified survivors, maybe 7 or 8 people in total, towards a short corridor at the rear of the gym, a narrow passage I hadn't even noticed before in the chaos. It led to a narrow, dimly lit staircase which, in turn, led up to the second floor, a forgotten upper level of the gym, a place we hadn't explored, a possible sanctuary. We thought if we got higher, if we reached the second floor, we could barricade a smaller area, find some defensible space, some fleeting moment of safety in the face of the approaching storm. As we stumbled down the dimly lit corridor, lightning flashed through a high window, illuminating the passage in a stark, momentary flash of white light. Torn posters, remnants of forgotten school events, and scattered papers littered the floor, swirling around our feet. The walls were scuffed, stained, some bearing cryptic markings, graffiti from years past, symbols and names we hadn't noticed before, details that were suddenly stark and unsettling in the context of our desperate flight. We pressed on, hearts thundering, each footstep echoing in the oppressive silence of the corridor. Then, a blood-chilling crash came from behind us, a deafening sound that made us all freeze in our tracks. The gym doors, our last line of defense, had finally given way, splintering and shattering, torn asunder by the relentless assault. The resulting chorus of screams, a collective howl of pure terror, twisted my insides, a visceral wave of fear that threatened to paralyze me completely. We heard a frenzied clamor of footsteps on the gym floor, a surging, chaotic rush of movement, the sound of something breaking in, something overwhelming, something unstoppable. Our flashlight beams wavered wildly across the corridor walls, illuminating the peeling paint, the shadowed corners, the sense of desperate urgency driving us onward. We picked up our pace, running now, stumbling, desperate to reach that second floor, that potential sanctuary. Rounding a corner, breathless, frantic, we discovered an office, a small, nondescript room with a heavy wooden door, a beacon of potential safety in the encroaching chaos. The sign on the door, barely visible in the dim light, read, Coach's office. Without hesitation, without a word, we hurried inside, pushing past each other in our desperate rush for shelter. James and two other stronger men helped push a heavy metal cabinet, salvaged from the corridor, against the door, creating a makeshift barricade, a fragile barrier against whatever was breaking into the gym, whatever was coming for us. The rest of us stood panting in the cramped space, our chests heaving, our hearts pounding in our ears, a frantic drumbeat against the rising tide of terror. The coach's office smelled musty, stale, like an old locker room, like an enclosed space filled with the ghosts of unworn sneakers and forgotten dreams. A single window, small and high on the wall, gave us a skewed, limited view of the night sky, a patch of storm-ridden darkness framed by the brick walls of the school. Rain had finally started to fall, a soft, hesitant tapping on the glass, a gentle sound that seemed incongruously peaceful. Yet even that delicate rhythm was overshadowed by the continued uproar from the gym below, the distant screams, the frantic clamor, the terrifying sounds of the building falling apart. We used our flashlights sparingly, clicking them off, plunging the office into near darkness, acutely aware that we might need to conserve batteries, to ration our last sources of light, for an unknown length of time for whatever waited next. Huddling together in the cramped office, strangers bound by fear and circumstance, we tried to calm each other, whispering words of reassurance that felt hollow even to our own ears. One person, a teenage girl, her face pale and tear-streaked, was sobbing softly, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably, a silent testament to the overwhelming terror gripping us all. Another, an older man, his face drawn, his eyes hollow with despair, crouched silently in the corner, his face frozen in a grimace of resignation, waiting for the inevitable. Sarah, ever resourceful, ever determined to find some semblance of hope in the darkness, pulled out a small candle from her bag, one of those emergency candles meant for power outages, a tiny, fragile beacon of light in the overwhelming gloom. She lit it, the small flame flickering to life, casting a warm, wavering glow that became a tiny, precious beacon against the encroaching darkness. The candlelight flickered, casting elongated shadows that danced across the walls of the cramped office, distorting familiar shapes, creating grotesque figures that seemed to writhe in the dim light. And in that fragile light, in that small, musty room crammed with strangers, bound together by shared fear and a desperate, dwindling hope, we waited for whatever was coming next. Wow, that first story really throws you into the deep end, doesn't it? Thinking about being trapped like that, watching everything fall apart around you. It's intense. What would you do? Would you be like Sarah, trying to hold on to hope and community? Or would the fear just be too much to handle? If you were hooked by that, if you want to know what happens next to Sarah, James, and the others huddled in that coach's office, let me know in the comments. Smash that like button, subscribe so you don't miss part 2, and tell me what you thought of the story so far. Seriously, your comments keep these stories coming. Part 2 is going to be even wilder, I promise. Don't get left behind in the dark.